Hi guys, I am Chris Negline, one of the co-hosts of the Nerdstravaganza podcast. I'm here with Will Hindmarch, who is an up-and-coming game designer, and we're hoping that he'll give some time before he blows up and he's forgotten all about us little people. So, tell us, off the start, how did you get into role-playing and how did you become a professional?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So the first time that I played any RPG that was actually a packaged role-playing game as opposed to just playing imaginary games and Cops and Robbers or Federation and Klingons, whatever we were playing, was a session of D&D the day before I started junior high school. It was a friend of mine's birthday and it was a sleepover, and I was super nervous because we were playing with some kids that I wasn't, that weren't big fans of me and I were not big fans of them, but we could be at the same birthday party, so it wasn't terrible. But by the end of that first session, two things had changed, I think, kind of forever. And one of them was that me and this other kid had become very good friends because we had learned the value of healing magic and the value of a sturdy blade. And the other big breakthrough for me was I had seen the rest of my life in game form. Whatever I'm doing, I'm always still going to be doing RPGs professionally to some extent because I can't shake it. It's like going to the gym for me because that's, you can probably tell, it's the only kind of gym that I go to. But is that I start feeling cagey and edgy if I don't get to play after about 2 weeks. And it's not even like whether it's playing or GMing, I prefer to GM, but is that discovering that conversation, that building of a world through conversation, that collaboration of imaginations was just such the right kind of social salve that I needed to come out of my shell a little bit and learn how to meet people. Without giving up the fact that I would much rather talk about the Federation and the Klingons, especially at that age, or to talk about elves and orcs than I would to have conversations about real things at that age. And so it's given me a skill set that it makes much more comfortable for me to be able to talk about anything. And so, but it was that day we played the Saturday night before school on Monday, and then I was DMing I think Wednesday. I was just immediately said, all right, well, I'm doing this now. This is I found the thing. And so from that point, I played all through junior high and high school, variety of groups, lots of homebrew systems, lots of published systems, Star Wars D6, a little bit of Call of Cthulhu, lots of variations and home hacks of D&D, and then moved on to things like Castle Falkenstein as a game that I always like to mention because I was a sucker for that game when it came out in a big way. I really dug that game. I still do. And moved on to, in college, almost entirely games that I was building myself to the point that I was doing that instead of doing most of my homework. So that didn't go great, but I learned so much just by, we had 2 or 3 groups sometimes playing in the same universe, in kind of the same campaign. So it was a great education in world building and in learning how to interact with a variety of imaginations and keep continuity and build worlds that were engaging for people. And that turned into pitching to magazines and publishers and saying, I want to write for RPGs, and getting rightfully at the time that I was pitching, turned down a few times, more or less for saying, well, you don't have anything published, we don't know what you're capable of, we're not just going to buy an RPG from you until we see it. And again, rightfully so. But that turned into submitting during the D20 boom at the turn of the century to Atlas Games. I had a couple of things published, and then I joined the staff at Atlas as a little bit of a staff writer and some staff design, and also I was the guy who took stuff to the post office and everything. So I started working my way up from that position. I was the feng shui line developer back in the day, and then moved on to White Wolf in 2004. I was there 3 years, I think. Went back to freelancing. I've been kind of freelancing off and on that whole time in there for various publications, and I've been an independent designer and publisher and freelancer since then and since before then. So my goal is to write one of everything. I have some comics in the works. I'm writing some stories for Munchkin from Boom Studios. The first one of those just came out in issue 12. It's got my name on it. I've done I've done a variety of short stories. I've written some screenplays that have never been, I hope will never be produced because they're my first efforts and they're not very good, but I'm learning. And I've done a lot of video game writing and things like that. So marketing materials, plays, poetry. But gaming is the one that I keep coming back to as far as if all other forms of writing were to no longer work for work, if I couldn't write for a living, I would still be writing for gaming.
Well, as a quick sideline, I believe every company you've mentioned is out there on the shelf here at the Adventure Game Store.
Absolutely.
And what are you working on right now?
So my current project is with great and endearing thanks to all of my backers, a grossly overdue Kickstarter project that has turned out so much better, not just because of the support from Kickstarter and from all the backers of Kickstarter, but from their patience. Because it's a game called Project Dark, which is a stealth. Project Dark is a stealth adventure role-playing game for 1 to 4 players and a GM. But so it can be played 1-to-1, or it can be played. It gets a little heistier if you add more players. So it starts off as being like a Splinter Cell or a Thief or what have you, and then as you add players, it just gets a little bit more like Leverage or whatnot. And it's got 3 different settings. There's a fantasy setting, a kind of near future setting, and a far future setting. And they all use the same core rules. And it's a card-driven role-playing game. It uses regular playing cards instead of dice for the players. And so there's a deck-building element where you put cards from a regular poker deck back into your deck as you level up. So you're like, oh, so I'm going to buy the 10 of clubs, so I have that now, and I know it's in there, and it will come up. But there's no like additional buying component or anything. It's just a regular deck of poker cards. So you start with some of them, and then you add in face cards, and they'll have special abilities for just your characters. So your Jack of Clubs and my Jack of Clubs might do 2 different things. But then as you play that, we through the stretch goals and such, we're able to fund a original deck. So we have a poker deck that's being painted by Rachel Kahn, which is a gorgeous
I've seen
set
the
of
art.
cards.
In
Right?
fact, it's funny enough that you mentioned Castle Falkenstein. I can tell you, I got it in my notes that, I was like, those cards look a lot like Castle Falkenstein for some reason.
Part of it definitely, right, is that Falkenstein was kind of the eye-opener for me, at least personally, of what other kind of ready-to-use or unusual kind of components can I find and use for games in addition to or instead of dice or whatever. And so I've been kind of chipping away at this deck-building idea for years. And it was one of those things where it took me months to realize that the stealth game I wanted to do and the card game that I wanted to do were the same game. But when I finally put them together, it started to make a lot of sense, because one of the things that the deck mechanic does in Dark is you like on a D20, if you're like me, you know there's a 20 on the die, but you will never see it. It's never going to come up, because you're not going to roll often enough for it to come up, or you're going to roll like I do, and you're just not going to ever see the 18, the 19, the 20. You're not that lucky. And so in Dark, you know the 10 of clubs is in there, for example. You know that your ace of spades is in there. And so you can plan ahead without having to plan out a whole mission, but you can say, okay, so we're going to move this way. I'm going to hold on to my ace so I can use it as kind of my critical hit when it comes up, because you have a hand of cards that's based on the more hidden your character is, the more cards you can hold. So the more stealthy you stay, the better your plans hold up, and the more your ability to kind of predict and respond works out. So I like it because it's a little, as a player, a little more, I don't want to say necessarily more rewarding, but it's differently rewarding because you can take heart in the fact that sooner or later the 20 is going to come up on that die. And so it creates a situation for the player that naturally breeds a little bit of confidence and has a little bit of the kind of a thrill of competence and seeing characters do things really, really well, so that you feel like you're a better thief than you would if you had to rely solely on, rolling over a 10 on a 20-sided die, for example. Which is not to say, for example, there are games that, I love a wide variety of games despite my luck, and I play a lot of rogues and thieves in D&D as well, but the dynamic is very, very different, just in the same way that I love that rogues can be good combatants and good investigators and stuff in D&D, but by turning the whole game so that we know that everybody's playing a thief in some degree, or everybody's skullduggerous in some degree, changes the focus a little bit, so that suddenly, if I want to play a stealth game, I want to sneak through the building, you're not just waiting around for me to miss a roll and then we can storm in, right? We all have kind of the same motive. And so part of that is just in the same way that in D&D everybody has a base attack bonus or has a natural kind of combat ability to some extent, because combat comes up and we all want to survive it. In Dark, everybody has a natural, a certain number of cards that are already in the deck, and everybody has a natural knack for thievery and stealth. That means that the game is inherently about that in a way that makes it easier for us to understand. We're just not going to consider the possibility of, we're not going to plan for, what if we were to just storm the building and kick the door down? That's not what the game's about. In games like Thief, where you could play the video game, where you could get in over your head and then still get lucky and kill everybody. In Dark, the characters are very squishy. And it's possible to build a character that will survive a lot of punishment, but by default they don't. So getting caught is really bad. So
it sounds like to me that you definitely want to have the rules and the setting reflect each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Because sometimes, one of the comments I've always had with the D&D magic system is that it in no way really reflects what would be the metaphysics of the setting itself.
Right, and but certainly depending on which D&D setting it is, right? That some settings feel like a better fit for the D&D magic system than others, and even though they all have the D&D logo on them or have over the years. Yeah. For me, it's very important, and it's especially important in stealth as a genre, which is not very well represented in RPGs, but in which, because the player controls so much of the pacing in a stealth game, right? They decide how fast to move. They decide when they see the NPCs, if they sneak up on somebody or if they sit and watch them and wait for them to have a conversation and let them talk, as opposed to in a combat-oriented game where the first time you meet an NPC, it's likely that you're either going to, you might try to talk your way past them, but it's overt. The NPC knows you're there and you know that they're there. And so the things that happen are based on seeing an NPC. For example, maybe at their fightiest moment. I meet an orc and they want to kill me, so we fight. If you sneak up on somebody and you see what orcs are like when they don't know you're around, suddenly the environment and the natural state of the setting is not only differently important, but it becomes broader. Because the notion is we might see orcs at their best. We might see an NPC when they are afraid that I might be there, but they don't know that I'm already in the room with them. Or they think, oh yeah, let them come and try to steal the diamond tonight. I'll kill that thief, no problem. And whatever it is, you get to see different facets and aspects of an NPC beyond, I'm going to kill that guy. Right now, let's fight. And so as that dynamic changes, the environment comes through. We have a thing in Dark which are called eavesdrops, turning the verb into a noun, which are little handouts that the GM gives out that are written for the adventures that are conversations between the NPCs. And if you have multiple players, the players can take the parts and read them. And it's a mechanism that on the one hand rewards the players for eavesdropping on the environment as opposed to just killing everybody outright. They gain secrets and information and they find out where the keys are hidden and those sorts of things. But it also engages the players, it rewards them for doing that by saying the players have the right, in most eavesdrops, there are a handful of exceptions in a couple of the adventures that are coming out, but the player can say, okay, at this moment between lines 3 and 4, that's when I strike. And the player, therefore, is making a dramatic decision, which is, so they never even have the back half of this conversation. I, as a player, know what it would have been, and we understand that obviously my character doesn't learn that information, but I can pick dramatic timing in a way that's difficult with a more randomized system. So the game is favoring the player in a lot of ways that says, join me in the pacing, join me in the portrayal of the setting. Your characters are competent, but they're not unstoppable. But that the player gets to make a lot of choices that might be randomly determined in some other games. And part of that is designed, again, to make the setting translate to the player at the pace that the player needs it to. So that in D&D it can be hard, or in any combat game, any game where you're fighting whether it's a gun battle in Shadowrun or you're fighting in D&D, to stop and say, can I get a new description of the room? It just feels contrary right to the pacing. But a player who can say, before I strike, I want to double check, what are the windows like in here? And those sorts of things. Means that, in a similar way that the gumshoe system is so great at, that it creates a situation where the player's skills say how much information they get out of the world. Well, I'm an expert in the occult, or I'm an expert in theology, I'm an expert in archaeology. How does this room appear to me versus how it might appear to my partner, my accomplice, who is all knowledgeable in art and breaking bones? And so that means that the character intersects with the game world in a very tangible way, and that it's not a chance that they will intersect with the game world. It's that you can say, well, you're an expert in archaeology, so when you're in here, you know that all the things in here are fakes. All this stuff is not the real treasure. This room is a sham. So either their whole lives are a sham and they don't have the treasure you were looking for, or they're trying to outsmart you. And leveling with the player that way and giving that kind of information, I think it helps convey the confidence that their characters can have and a certainty about the way they interact with the world that helps the setting to come alive.
All right, so in the big spin with the gunshoe system is where, like in D&D, you have a perception roll.
Right.
If the perception roll isn't made, then that clue doesn't get delivered.
Right.
And if the GM hasn't thought it through, suddenly the whole adventure is just kind of sitting in a holding pattern until he figures out he's got to put the clue somewhere else, or make another roll.
Right.
Or
keep rolling until you get a 10 or higher.
Exactly. And then why did you do it in the first place? And then with the gumshoe system, if you've got the right skill and you're in the right room, boom, there's the clue.
Right. And that explains a lot about the character and the world, right? Because the character knew certain things about the world when they walked into that room, even though we as players didn't know that information. And that's a vital thing to me about making characters and game worlds live together in a really fruitful way, is to remember that the characters live in that world all the time. So they know things about the world that we don't. So there are times when we want to make decisions, and it's like, well, my character is smarter than I am. They're a professional at this. So why are they going to make the kind of stupid mistake I would make? And this is an area where which I think Gumshoe is great at, and is that importable to any RPG, is that notion that don't roll for something unless you want to explore both success and failure. And in Gumshoe is kind of built on the notion that failure is just boring on these kind of actions. So we're just gonna, it's about positioning rather than chance. And that befitted Dark very well too, I should say, which has a skill system that is it's definitely post Gumshoe. It is a system that works because I admire Gumshoe the way that I do. And I've done some writing for, I did Eternal Lies for Pelgrane and so forth. But is that the ability to get into a building and say, well, I can use my skill to understand, to puzzle out where they've hidden the gem, if I can get into the Duke's library. So suddenly, whereas in Gumshoe, it's a investigative process to find out, can I get to the right place for this skill to reveal the clue automatically? Dark just puts a little more emphasis on how do I get there, how hard is it to reach there, makes it a little more adventurous and exciting to put yourself in the room when you're not supposed to be there. You're not a detective, officially, you don't have the right to be in that room. But since anybody who's sneaking around a castle or a manor or a space station or whatever it is, has to play detective a little bit because you can't just ask for directions. So you want to suss out what's going on. So that Gumshoe dynamic works very, very well, somewhat ironically, for both the detectives of so many Gumshoe games and the criminals that they would ostensibly be trying to capture. And there's actually a little bit in Dark, the GM sometimes between sessions plays the role of what's called the capital I, the inspector. And that is essentially the GM is playing a Gumshoe game while the players are creating clues to find out what the inspector can pick up about the player characters after the job. What do they leave behind? That the inspector says, look, I have this red hair, I have this eyelash, I'm going to take it to a scryer here in town, I'm going to take it to a warlock or somebody who's going to tell me whose hair this is. And so the inspector is playing Gumshoe in the wake of the player characters playing Dark, to a certain extent.
And speaking of Castle Falkenstein, that reminds me, because one of the best bits of GM advice they had was, have the GM play the villain. Think of what the villain is going to go through. It's not like you're planning the adventure and the players are... It's not for the players, it's for, here's the villain, here's his through line of what he's planning, and where do the players intersect there, and how does that all fall out?
Right, what happens if the players don't show up?
Exactly.
I'm a big believer in that one, is the notion that the world wants, the characters in the world, aside from the NPCs, or aside from the PCs, aren't waiting around for the PCs to do something. They have their lives going on. And they have plans. And even if you're, whether you're a occult investigator in the 1930s, whether you're slaying vampires and Knights of Black Agents, whether you are hunting Dracula himself, I should point out, Knights of Black Agents, or whether you are sneaking into a house in some fantasy medieval landscape, whatever you're doing, everybody else in the setting is hoping maybe, they're hoping maybe you'll do something else. And so when those two things collide and we find out which way things are going to go, that's a guaranteed creator of plot, if not necessarily of story. I'm a big believer when it comes to role-playing games that you can't really pre-plot, but you can pre-motivate a character, an NPC. And plot is just a series of colliding motives. It's a series of decisions and fallouts. And then a story is how that is told and how that is structured. And one of the great examples, of course, is the movie Memento, right, which has a very linear plot. It's just played backwards. Sometimes when watching, you can feel like it's a very convoluted plot. But Nolan himself has said, the director has said, points out that it's a pretty clear plot. This person makes this decision, which causes this person to make this decision, which causes this person to shoot that person, which causes this person to get arrested or whatever. I'm not spoiling the movie, because none of that is actually how it works in the movie. But then what they do is they just play it backwards. They play the scenes in reverse order. And so the storytelling is very ornate and is very complicated because you have to keep track of the story in reverse. But the plot is very simple. And we often conflate them, but I think it's especially in gaming, in RPG play, it's important to appreciate and kind of help master the difference between the two of them, because you can create situations where the players are completely in control of the plot, and you just say, well, look, the villain is going to conquer the world unless somebody stops him. And fortunately, here come the player characters, and I don't know if they're going to stop them or not. I didn't pre-decide that, but I have a sense of the theme and the atmosphere. I have a sense of what kind of imagery I want to bring up, but I don't know if I'm going to be bringing up this idea I have of white doves flying away when somebody is slain in a duel. I don't know if those doves are going to represent the spirit of a dead player character or a dead villain. But I have an idea that I think would be dramatic, and I may have to jettison it during play. I may have to make up something else depending on how the plot goes. But that it's a matter of, I know what kind of decisions the villain's going to make, and I know what kind of, I'm going to wait and find out what decisions the players are going to make, and not try to necessarily prescribe for the players, because they're kind of the great randomizer, in a way. And so, even though I might have ideas like, I think I could provoke them into fighting the villain in the scene, I could be wrong. No plan survives contact with the player characters. So.
No, never. So, funny enough,
Yeah.
Feng Shui 2 just came out too.
Yeah, yeah. Which I did not work on.
I know you didn't work on, but you know, you were part of that line. What do you think of?
Oh god, I have only one, and it's a fairly substantial. I don't know if I should be saying this. I have one fairly substantial problem with Feng Shui 2, and it's not actually a problem with Feng Shui 2 per se, as much as it's very different from what I would have done when I was running Feng Shui, which is I would have let me do it when I was the Feng Shui developer. I would have wanted to be a part of it, and that's really the only. As an admirer, I was a fan of Feng Shui, but I hadn't played it as much as I had played like hacks of it before I started, pitching for writing games and stuff. So I had a lot of experience pulling Feng Shui apart, and then you see how Robin does it for the sequel, how he actually reinvigorates and what he tweaks and what he doesn't adjust, and where he twists and tightens the bolts in that game. And I suddenly wonder when my third eye gets to open as a developer, and I get to say, "Oh, of course, that's how you do it." It's such a, and in addition to being a beautiful book and just a great product, and I love the idea. It's a little bit contentious, but they've essentially said that line is complete with the Kickstarter done and what goes into stores. They don't need to do source books because you could play hours and hours and hours and hours of Feng Shui too. And I don't know if they'll change their mind, but I like the idea that part of the beauty of Feng Shui is that it kind of has a lot of arc to it. Like you can see into the future of Feng Shui because of its timelines and its time periods, but there's no need to necessarily extend and dig a whole lot deeper into the individual NPCs, the individual factions and such, because the players are just going to come in and wreck them all anyway. So respond more. And the game, I think, is very well built for... it's a great example of learning a lot from post-Feng Shui games without forgetting its Feng Shui-ness, without trying to completely revamp Feng Shui. I really wanted to do a second edition when I was at Atlas, for example, and the powers that be, which I can name happily as John, Nephew, and Robin Laws, had said it's not time, and in hindsight they were absolutely right, because if I had been able to do Feng Shui 2, it would not have been the edition we got, in part just because there are games that came out in between that would have changed, and it was what I wanted to do was not necessarily a super engaging time for omnivorous gamers in RPGs. We were still playing a lot. D20 was still booming, and we were playing a lot of long-term campaigns in a different way. That now I feel like RPG players are a little more omnivorous, which is great, because it means that if a game comes out, they can approach it like a board game and say, "We're going to play 2 sessions of this thing, and we'll play it again in a year or whatever." But it's not like they're committing to a 6-month or a year-long campaign with something. So they're a little more willing to experiment with new games and try out stuff that has very different rule sets. And Feng Shui benefits from that because mechanically there aren't a lot of games that are terribly like Feng Shui, so it comes out in a time when people are much more hungry and curious about different types of role-playing games. So the only kind of credit that I can take is that I agreed it was a good idea, and I was in a focus group for it at Metatopia, in which all I essentially did was applaud the direction that they were going in, because I was so happy with what they were doing with NPCs and how they were revising gun sticks and so forth. So yeah.
So when it comes to the dark,
yeah,
how do you see that being played at the table? Is it a long campaign, or is it either or? It's
it's definitely, it plays very well single shot. I've run it, most of what I've run in actual games logged, and I ran the numbers on this. I don't think it's changed too much since the last time I ran the numbers on it. But is that most of the games I've played have been one shots of it, teaching people the game at Origins, teaching people the game at Gen Con, playing it with one shot people in Chicago. But the number of hours logged is about 50-50, because I've played a number of campaigns with my playtest groups and with some 2- and 3-part campaigns with little local groups and stuff. And it's been the game, and this is one of the big things that actually expanded since the Kickstarter. Was originally designed to be very mission driven. So you might play 3 or 4 kind of scenarios, and then good, you had a good time, and you can keep playing, or you don't have to keep playing, whatever. But what that led to was the situation that the mission-driven aspect of play was pretty strong. I was pretty happy with it, but there were still things we added in and made clear. But the campaign play wasn't being adequately supported, and so that's a big part of what we were doing the latter half of last year. I say we. That's both its lateness and everything is my fault. But is that what I was working on was adding the campaign dimensions, and what that ended up being was making it so that you're still playing mission-based games, so that it's very easy to break a campaign for a couple of weeks or a couple of months and come back to it. In part because when you with the deck building component, right, you make your character's deck, then you put it in a box, and well, there's my character, I know where to find him. And you don't necessarily lose the sheet or whatever it is. I mean, they are character sheets, but when you come back, they just tell you what your jack does or your queen does, that sort of thing. When you come back to the game and you say, I want to explore the fallout of the fact that I stole this magic jewel or something, There's a lot more tools now. There are a lot more tools in the book for the narrator or the GM to be able to say who else in the city has a reaction for it. What we do, for example, there's a process we do when we build out the treasures for the campaign, which is who has it, who wants it, what will they pay for it, who will notice it's missing and when. And essentially blowback is what it really is. And so with those sort of things in mind, you can just very easily, and then you just sort of assign the treasures to the world map that we have, to the city map. And you can say, and now the players can go off and steal stuff in anywhere they want, and you can give them a certain sense of, this one is going to be really hard to get, so maybe you don't want to do it first, because you don't have all the cards in your deck yet. But they can go off and steal them in any way they want, and then as that happens, the players can, what we call casing the joint, it's the investigative portion of the game, in which they can investigate, well, first I want to know where this thing is. Okay, sure. I want to know roughly what I can get for it. Of course, that makes sense. And I want to know who is going to want it back, and how mad they're going to be that it's gone. Those sort of questions. And so they can spend some time asking these questions about multiple items, and then choose and say, well, this one seems to have a good cost-benefit ratio. Nobody's going to really care if we take it, but it's going to be worth something to us, so we'll start with that one. And if you take it, the GM may know, because there's a column that the players don't ever get to see for each item, which is the notion of essentially the fallout, the blowback, which is are there people who secretly are saying, yes, I want that item, I can't pay for it, so once it hits the market or hits the fences, I'm just going to kill to get it. Or that say, great, I'm going to hire then somebody to steal it again. And so the players say, wait, is this ruby that we're stealing the same ruby we stole 2 weeks ago? Yeah, because lots of people want it. It's a magic ruby. Say, so are we just building up a giant enemies list of people who are going to want to kill us for stealing their ruby? Yeah, because you're thieves. Let's not lie to ourselves. This is what the life is in this city. And so now there's a much stronger campaign structure for it, both in terms of what the investigator can do to follow the players around the city, when the investigator does or does not know what the characters are up to, when they can establish, for example, somebody steals the Mona Lisa, let's say, or something the fantasy equivalent thereof, and that the inspector can tell from the skill levels of the characters, for example, what's publicly known, and the inspector learns this stuff publicly as more and more missions are undertaken, more and more evidence is left behind. The inspector says there are only 3 people in the world who could have stolen that painting, and then they have to say, well, I know one of them has an alibi, and one of them is this player character, and the other one is that other player character. And so the player characters start making decisions about, well, I'd love to steal the Mona Lisa, not just for my reputation, but for the money, or not just for the money, but for my reputation. And then they say, but I can't move it, I can't sell it, because if anybody knows roughly where it went, I don't know that the person I sell it to isn't going to just turn me in for the bounty on my head as well. There's a whole social network mechanic from your skills, that your skills indicate both your knowledge, gumshoe style, and your placement in a social network about that skill. So if you're trained in art, you know how to appraise art, and you know people who will buy stolen art. And the more points you have, the wider your network. But the inspector moves back through that network towards you to find out, hey Eddie, who stole the Mona Lisa? I'm not talking! And then eventually the inspector gets a turn between missions, and they can essentially make Eddie talk. And that will move the inspector one step closer to you, depending on how good your network is.
So the inspector sounds like he's basically a ticking time bomb. He's
right, yeah. And the question becomes, and it influences then how the characters spend their XP, because they can essentially expand their network, so they can say, I'm going to put somebody between me and Eddie, so that when the inspector turns Eddie, he doesn't just catch me next week. But the inspector is not a force, it's a person. So they can be gotten to. So if the players literally get to the inspector and have a role-playing scene, they might have a situation in which they say, so what is it going to cost to make this go away? And so we still have the RPG. It's not just that board game being played in the background. It's an RPG element that takes that ticking time. It's like it's like a web of fuses. And so you light the fuse and you don't know which route it's going to take before it reaches you. And so the part of the question is, when do I retire from this job and end the campaign? And when do I decide I've had enough money? And which leads to a question that once you have a ton of money in this feudal society, when do thieves start stealing from you?
So it's kind of a push your luck sort of thing.
A little bit, yeah.
So what kind of settings fascinate you?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm actually not as into lately super finely detailed or pinned down settings as it might seem. I like them to evolve and play. I like them to develop more and play. I mean, I love those sorts of things, but I tend not to play in for example, I love The One Ring as an RPG. I think it's a great game. I don't play in it a whole lot, literally, because Middle-earth is so well documented. So what I like in settings is a bit of room to maneuver. I like an atomic structure so that we have lots of details, but that they're not laid out in such a fashion that the outcome of certain player decisions is obvious. So what I want is a system where a player can say, so what happens if I have to kill to defend myself in this fantasy city? And the answer is everybody who kills themselves is automatically detected by the seers and then put in jail. And you go, so there's not really a story there because we know the outcome. I want something that says, seers might be able to detect you, and this is what happens if they do, and this is roughly what bribes cost, and it can get very nuanced, but it can also just create the structure, the feeling that says, the system isn't perfect, wherever this fantasy setting is, it's alive, and it gives me feelings like, if I walk down the street of this fantasy city, what am I going to see and hear and smell? What are the streets made out of? So I like really fine tactile details so that I can deploy them gradually over the course of play. And so they help players be inspired to figure out, well, if the buildings are made out of stucco, then I can figure roughly what they feel like and what it might be like inside, and how I have a sense of what it's like to decorate them, or what the light is like, or if they're adobe, or whatever. The ability to extrapolate and then add into a world to me is really important, and that doesn't necessarily come at the expense of detail, but it does often come at the expense of detail in the practicality sense of how many words and pages you can put in a book. So I love Fiasco, for example, obviously, where you can make up so much on the fly and very little is nailed down. But Fiasco benefits greatly from playsets that assume that we can open Wikipedia and say, yeah, so we're playing on the Titanic, and I'm just curious, how many decks was the... Why would you put that information in the playset? It doesn't have to be there, it's everywhere. So a big part is also that what I like in... I'm a bigger fan of secondary worlds than say, Ken or Robin are. Both of whom have an appreciation, but Ken is a historian and a cultist and a lore master of the highest order, and I really like secondary worlds, but I like them to have roots. I like them to be able to reveal how they connect to the real world, so that I can play the role of the world builder even when I'm just being the DM. Even if it's not my campaign setting, I can pretend to be Tolkien in addition to pretending to be an orc.
So, with your fascination with second worlds,
yeah.
It sounds like to me you prefer more of a sort of like a human-centric sort of world versus different races.
I generally do. That's true. I'm part of it is because I like players playing humans in odd circumstances. I like the humanity to be a part of the handhold that we have for a character. And this is interesting that in Tolkien, for example, the elves and dwarves, or in so much of D&D, the characters are human enough that that's not a problem for me. And I like the occasional, and part of this because I'm, again, a child of Star Trek, I like the occasional really alien. But in a cast of player characters, I like as many humans as possible, and then one or two aliens or robots or what have you. And part of that is just because the audience is all humans. And I'm kind of a dramatist, I guess, as much as I'm anything, and so humanity and the complexity, the stuff that we wrestle with as people, is kind of limitless. We're always going to be wrestling with this stuff. We're never going to solve the human situation, just in terms of, so what does it mean to be human? We can ask that question for as long as there are people, because even if we figure it out, we're going to have a new generation of people who haven't figured it out yet. We all have to go through that question process. And I think one of the benefits of role-playing is the ability to build empathy and the ability to build sympathy with other humans. And the more of that time that we spend building it with people who bear no resemblance to anything in reality can be great for the imagination, and it can be a great imaginary exercise and a great process in creativity. But I think, for example, I'm not very interested in settings that have no humans. Because I want to know how it relates to not necessarily just my life, not in any kind of like moralistic or teaching, necessarily pedagogical style, but I do want to be able to week have the option of saying, this time, not necessarily that I'm going to learn something as much as I'm going to get a chance to use something I learned and use it to make a game world richer and make the play session richer for everybody. And by and large, it's a way of asking questions that have interesting answers as opposed to, or I should say myriad interesting answers, so that the players can each answer it differently, and then we learn about their characters. As opposed to asking questions like, will your character steal in a world where all theft is automatically detected and they will just recover the item? The obvious answer is no. It doesn't work. And we've got some stealing solved in this fantasy setting. Everybody's a robot. Well, then what do we do? What do you really do in this setting? And it goes back to the classic conundrum of RPGs, right? Who are they and what do they do? And who are the player characters and what do they do? And I like generally for one of them to be highly fantastical or alien and the other one to be less so. and this is interesting because I'm kind of just putting part of that together right now, is realizing that I like those pans to be balanced in their counters, but not necessarily in the notion of, they don't have, if one tips, that's fine, but you want to be in control of it. So I like the idea of emergency medical technicians trying to save aliens in a futuristic city. Because I can put the aliens in the what do you do or who are you, and that can change mission to mission, call to call. But I want there to be humans, and I want to be able to, players to be able to predict or imagine the city easily, so it's still an earthly city or what have you. So the more elves or orcs you add in, the more I want it to be about tangible stuff that I can look up on Flickr or Google image search to get a sense of. So what do castles in this place look like? I guess they're kind of like old Assyrian architecture, and then there's also inspired by a lot of like late medieval Indian subcontinent designs and stuff. And so I can research this stuff and get ideas, or I can not and go completely imaginary, and that's part of that atomic structure of a setting. So I like that connection to reality and through humanity and through human history, but it's also a question of, if it's totally alien, I don't know how to get into the building. I don't know if I can't identify what a door is in this setting, I don't know how to get into it. So,
I think one of the things, some writing advice someone gave once is you can have exotic characters, but it has to be in a mundane setting, or you can have an exotic setting, but you have to focus on the mundane characters.
I think certainly right. Yeah, the more you turn one of those dials, the more one way, the more you want to counterbalance it with the other one. And it's worth noting that, for example, with like a word like exotic, right, which is so much about POV. To me, for example, the word exotic means something that I don't particularly understand, but I already find fascinating, which is not necessarily the definition of that word. But for example, I know I have a tendency to use it to mean. Here's a great example, actually, is that I have done some study, and I'm fascinated by Indian art from the continent, from essentially East India Company forward, or rather backward. And I'm fascinated by their art and history, but I don't speak the language. I actually don't know a lot about the politics. And so I have this great appreciation, and I'm really into the style of it. But because I'm not an expert, I try not to bring it into design very often, because I'm going to get it wrong. I'm not well versed in it. But I'm fascinated by it, engaged by it, and I buy books on it because it is so appealing and appeals to me in a way that just kind of a visceral, immediate way of. I'm part of it. I'm a sucker for things like, whatever. I'm a fan of elephants and jewelry and these kinds of things that are so well celebrated by a lot of the surviving work. But it's interesting because I think that advice of the exotic versus the mundane, I know writers who have misinterpreted it to mean that mundane is bad and exotic is alien or something, right? And to me, what it's always meant is that the mundane is relatable. And the exotic is something that I appreciate and think is great, even though I may not fully understand why yet, or my experience is when somebody talks about whether uses the word exotic, it can be used positively or negatively, and I try to use it right just to me. And similarly, when I interpret that advice, is to say exotic meaning I may not fully understand it when I set out to start this story. I'm going to do the research, but I know I want to do the research because it's really compelling. So.
Okay, so
yeah.
In your other projects you're working on. Have you been doing genre stuff, or is it more of
I do a lot of genre work, yeah. I'm pretty, again, because of the freedom of it. I've done some magazine work and such that was completely real-world nonfiction, some interviews and things like that. And I enjoy those, but when left to my own devices, it's not a question really of if genre, but how much genre. I've written some fairly realistic, not necessarily to say hard sci-fi, for example, but there's always still enough in it that I wouldn't probably be able to pitch it as literature to somebody. It's still going to be genre. And that doesn't bother me because, even as somebody who wants to write one of everything, the genre divide bothers me only in the sense that it gets given a weight sometimes, I think mistakenly, when really genre pertains mostly to helping people find books they will love. There's a lot of literature that contains genre elements, and there's a lot of genre that is effectively literature, except we decided that the characters are on another planet or what have you. And whether or not we decide whether or not it's literature versus genre fiction is more a factor of which shelf do I go to look for it on at the bookstore or at Amazon or wherever. And I think we see that, for example, in things like board games have actually adapted this really well, which is that what the game is about, mechanically and in its theme, is how we talk about the game. Even though the game might be deeply historical or deeply unrealistic, we don't organize board games, at a store like this, and wisely so. We don't organize them by categories like, this game is highly historical, and this game is not. They might end up grouped a little bit together on the shelf. We don't have a literary section and a fantasy section, right? They're more grouped by, so how does it play? Or how easy is it for me to, which one of these 10 do I start with? And that's great because that in a board game that's about actual play. And in reading, it's about helping somebody find a story that is going to move them or engage them, and ideally in a way that they are setting up to be engaged. So I think the job of genre then becomes, I really want to read about spaceships. Cool, so I can tell you what part of the store to look in. I really want to read about the human condition. Cool, I can still help you find classic literature on the topic. I want to read about the human condition, and spaceships are cool. If they're spaceships, that's fine. Right? That's actually a little harder sometimes. And I have to start knowing about authors and things like that. So, and part of it for me is just that who doesn't like a good spaceship?
Right. So we're wrapping up. We're almost out of time here at the Adventure Game Store. Is there an upcoming project you want to pitch real quick?
Oh, that's a great question too. You know, I've been so myopic with the variety of little projects that I've been doing, and with the monolith of Project Dark in front of me. Well, one of the things I should say absolutely. So, Game Playwright Press, which I'm one of the partners of. We have books like The Bones, Us and Our Dice, and Things We Think About Games are out. Hamlet's Hit Points is one of ours. And we have a number of books coming forward, so people should keep an eye on the Game Playwright Twitter account. But Project Dark is coming soon. We're wrapping up the cards, right? We're very hopeful. There's a lot of actually big progress that has happened just in the last couple of weeks, and so there's new information going out electronically, and it will be in stores, the stores that I have the right kind of relationship right now to shop to, because I don't know if it'll end up in informal distribution. But I know that it will be available in a bunch of the stores with great role-playing crowds that we've talked to through the Kickstarter and beyond. And then, of course, I have a couple of stories in the Munchkin comic from Boom Studios, so you can find those starting with issue 12 and in the occasional issue going forward. And to keep an eye, I guess, on Twitter, @WordWill. I will absolutely tell you lots of stuff you don't want to know, and also what's going on with me professionally. So.
Well, thank you. It has been a pleasure.
Thanks, Chris.
And look forward to chatting with you a little bit after our interview.
Awesome.
So that's our interview with Will Hindmarch. And keep an eye out for his Project Dark. And this again is the Nerdstravaganza podcast at the Adventure Game Store.